just joining this discussion on cost and value for the first time, I'm going to introduce you to this paper and quickly run through what it's about, what our findings were. This paper, as Tyler said, is the product of over, I think we're about 3 years of discussions within our multi-stakeholder steering group with previous participants at other minerals forums that we organized in previous years, as well as bilateral interviews with different stakeholders and smaller multi-stakeholder discussions that we conducted over the years. I think the best way to talk you all through the paper is to cover the same series of questions that we asked ourselves and that we asked the stakeholders, and show you how the findings and our conclusions kind of logically flow from there. So the first, obviously, big question is, what is the problem? What is the purpose of this paper? And Tyler summed it up quite nicely in the beginning. I'm just going to repeat. This paper was drafted in response to calls from stakeholders to look at the imbalance of the due diligence burden among different actors in the supply chain. And at the heart of this issue is that for smaller, more vulnerable, usually upstream supply chain actors, the costs of due diligence are relatively very high, and the prices paid for minerals may not reflect the value generated from their due diligence efforts. So for example, the costs of implementing corrective action plans, of undergoing inspections and spot checks, of setting up your professional due diligence record keeping and management systems, and other risk mitigation actions. The guidance makes clear that due diligence is the individual responsibility of all businesses and should be considered a cost of doing business. So then why are high due diligence costs an issue that needs to be addressed? Well, to answer this, we need to understand the objectives of the guidance, which is number one, to stop contribution to adverse impacts in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And number two, to promote economic and social development in those areas, those CARAs, as we will call for short, through greater market access of responsibly sourced material. So stop contribution to adverse impacts, promote economic and social development. And as the slide shows, there seems to be a disconnect with these objectives and with the reality of the market, and that accessing the market responsibly from a CARA may require prohibitively high investments in due diligence efforts for a lot of smaller supply chain actors. So what's causing this disconnect? Put simply, because of how minerals are traded and the dynamics in the market, it is a buyer's market. For most minerals, the value of due diligence in the aggregate flows downstream, while the cost of due diligence plus the costs of participating in certification programs or audits are pushed upstream. So what do we mean when we refer to value then? And how can we understand this concept? So value in this context could be understood as the difference in price of the buyer's best alternative plus any monetary significance that the buyer assigns to certain seller-specific factors. In this case, the factor we're looking at is due diligence. So what effect does due diligence then have on value? Well, from what we gathered, it appears that due diligence acts as either a stabilizing factor, protecting the value from other negative factors, or in certain limited circumstances, so for example, gold and jewelry, due diligence can act as a positive or a value-enhancing factor. So, and increase the value of certain minerals to certain customers. You'll see some examples in this slide about how due diligence acts as a stabilizing factor or a value-enhancing factor. They're on the right-hand side of your screen. It's important to note, however, that questions still remain as to whether the smaller supply chain actors in the CARAs see the same value as downstream. So a lot of those positive factors may not be present for a lot of smaller supply chain actors. And in the course of the consultations for this study, many upstream supply chain actors saw market access really as the only value, and very rarely did they report other positive factors when we asked them in our question process to gather the information for this paper. So what are the challenges for upstream supply chain actors in implementing due diligence, and what are the market factors that seem to exacerbate some of these challenges that we can address when talking about solutions after I'm done presenting this paper? So smaller upstream actors generally have higher burdens to demonstrate more extensive due diligence measures. So for example, an artisanal mine site might need to set up professional controls, safety measures, and some other complementary measures to ensure that children are not involved in the worst forms of child labor at that site. Then they'd have to undergo follow-up mine site checks and potentially have to do all of this while suppliers have suspended sourcing from the mine. On top of that, because of market dynamics, it's difficult for these upstream actors to pass on those due diligence costs and those massive investments that they made to mitigate the risk. It's very difficult for them to pass it on down the supply chain and to reflect that in the prices that they receive. In terms of the broader market challenges, it's reported that many market actors are either avoiding artisanal and small-scale mining and CARA-linked materials, or they might be even paying premiums for minerals from low-risk regions, or accepting unscrutinized or due diligence-free minerals at an equal or lower price, which significantly undermines the market access value that upstream actors would want to see when they do business responsibly. Another point is that this kind of uneven global implementation of the guidance, which we discussed actually in our last panel, this kind of over-focus potentially on certain regions, can also harm artisanal and small-scale mining and making efforts to formalize much more difficult. And also erode the sustainability of responsible sourcing initiatives kind of based in the region who are trying to scale up. So that is what we found in our interviews with stakeholders and in circulating the paper for feedback. In the paper, we describe these challenges in much more detail and offer some real world examples and backing evidence kind of based off of our consultations and also off of other desk research we found on this topic. In addition to analyzing those challenges that market actors face, the paper also tried to break down some of the cost sharing models that already exist and the efforts already in place to help reduce the costs to upstream supply chain actors. While none of these models represent the perfect solution to these upstream cost challenges, and they certainly have their limitations and drawbacks, which we do discuss in the paper, they do present certain factors that could be adapted into a potential kind of broader, more scalable solution. The first model we looked at, it's on the upper left-hand part of the screen, is the ITSCI, the International Tin Tantalum Supply Chain Initiative. This is a 3T industry initiative currently active in Central Africa, most active in Central Africa. It functions by collecting and processing upstream due diligence information, so from the mine to the smelter, and then supporting risk monitoring and risk mitigation actions for upstream actors in the region where they operate that are members of the system. It is supported mostly from the levies paid by the members based on metal content and tonnage of material that they export. And the levies are typically collected from the 3T traders and exporters. The second model we looked at was the Just Gold project, which is managed by the Canadian and international NGO Impact. The objective of the Just Gold project is to support responsible ASM gold and by creating incentives for upstream actors to sell through legal channels. And the way they do this is the project provides due diligence capacity building and technical assistance to upstream actors, and then facilitates international market access by connecting those upstream actors with interested downstream buyers who then agree to pay a competitive price for the material. In that particular model, the due diligence capacity building that Impact offers to the ASM sites is donor funded by government and private sector, with the objective that in the long term, the cost of these activities are covered by the price paid for the gold that they do sell. Once the project scales up. These costs may also be lessened kind of over time as the upstream actors assume more and more direct responsibility for their due diligence activities, and Impact takes maybe less of a role. And then the third model we looked at is the Responsible Minerals Initiative. The RMI is a global responsible sourcing program made up of mostly downstream companies. It is the overall objective of RMI is to provide their members with tools and resources to conduct due diligence and responsible sourcing. And it's funded through membership fees and individual company contributions for certain specific activities. So one of those activities that we analyzed in the paper is what RMI calls their initial audit fund for smelters and refiners. And the way that works is essentially the average smelter and refiner audit cost is roughly 6,000 to 7,000. I mean, obviously that depends on a number of other individual factors according to the smelter refiner, but the estimate we received was 6,000 to 7,000 US dollars. And for certain lower capacity smelters and refiners, RMI offers to offset that cost, the initial audit cost, and on the ground due diligence activities of the smelters and refiners, as well as certain follow-up reassessment costs. And then this model is an example of how voluntary individual downstream contributions can further support upstream due diligence, but only up to the point of the smelter and refiner, not kind of extending beyond that. And then finally, we looked at the fair mine model, which is an example of downstream contributions to upstream due diligence, all the way upstream, up to the mine site. It's managed by the Alliance for Responsible Mining. And under this model, ARM, the Alliance for Responsible Mining, works with certain mine sites to adopt a number of sustainability standards, which includes the OECD due diligence guidance, but also a number of other standards that go well beyond. And then once mine sites qualify, they can sell their gold at the fair mine premium price. And the fair mine premium costs an additional, at the time of writing the paper, $4,000 per kilo of gold. So it represents roughly 7.9 to 8% of the gold price. Profits from the premium are then expected to be reinvested into maintaining and improving the mine site's compliance with those standards that they sign up for, and then reinvested back into the community. So miners who were part of this program report that they consider the premiums really fundamental to their success and their growth and their ability to continue sourcing responsibly. So that's just a kind of broad overview of the models we looked at. Obviously, the paper goes into more detail. Throughout kind of the discussions and the drafting of this paper, a broad consensus emerged in bilateral and smaller multi-stakeholder discussions that we had about the state of play of this issue, and then recommendations on what might be needed moving forward. So on the nature of this issue, it was agreed that upstream actors face these challenges and face challenges in passing down due diligence costs. That due diligence might generate value for all supply chain actors, but in different and sometimes uneven ways. And that not all supply chains are the same, and that the issue and potential solutions for the issue will definitely vary by the mineral and by the geography. And then in terms of moving forward at a high level, it was observed and agreed upon that financial and logistical support for due diligence capacity building and monitoring activities in CARAs is necessary, that downstream and government need to be the ones providing this greater financial support to address these challenges, that investments need to be made in security, finance, and infrastructure in mineral producing countries. So this is beyond due diligence. It's about supporting logistics and the broader community that these issues take place in. And then, of course, support for enforcement efforts to combat the trade in illicit material or material without proper due diligence. And that comes from governments, but also self-regulatory industry bodies.